Welcome back to our walkthrough of the gay science. We're in the middle of book 2, the aphorisms that mostly concern art, although there's much more in these sections on language and on communication. Many of the themes from last week will continue today. But let's begin with 84. Quote, "On the origin of poetry, those who love the fantastic side of man and at the same time champion the notion of instinctive morality argue as follows. If we assume that utility had always been venerated as the supreme deity, how could we possibly account for poetry? After all, this rhythmic speech does anything but promote the clarity of communication, and yet it has shot up all over the earth and still does, as if it meant to mock expediency and utility. The wild and beautiful irrationality of poetry refutes your utilitarianism. It was precisely the desire to get away from utility for once that elevated man and furnished the inspiration for morality and art. Well, in this case, I have to side with the utilitarians. After all, they are right so rarely that it is really pitiful." End quote. So, a beautiful Nietzschean reversal of expectations. It's probably why Nietzsche is considered such a funny writer, especially so in the period of the gay science, because this is quite literally a comedic structure, at least formally speaking, even though the content is philosophical. So we get this first paragraph where Nietzsche puts a certain sentiment in quotes. So someone else is speaking here. He's giving voice to a sentiment that he's not necessarily associating himself with. But he says, the idea that if we believe morals came from an instinctual origin, and then we try to account for what Nietzsche calls the fantastical side of man, his imaginative, creative, and idealistic capacities, we come to an impasse at certain points, particularly as regards the notion that was popular in Nietzsche's time, as well as today, that social mores and moral codes and religious rules and taboos must have developed following from a principle of utility, necessity, usefulness, so on. Notably, the example in this passage is poetry. And so, the argument would be that poetry offers us very little in the way of utility, at least when it comes to the necessities of survival, advancement of mankind, technologically or socially. Going all the way back to Plato, the insightful minds have recognized this, that the poets offer very little, if any, utility to society. But here Nietzsche immediately does an about-face, and he says, I side with utilitarians because they're so often wrong that we really have to give them credit where it's due whenever they happen to be right. That's the punchline to the joke, if you will. Nietzsche siding with utilitarians. So, beyond just almost the comedic aspect of this, why does he do this? Well, we'll continue with the passage in which Nietzsche explains how it is that poetry, rhythm in speaking, a meter to one's speech, a structure, actually provided a great, great utility to ancient man. It's just that what they would find useful is so far from our own conception of utility, which reveals something, by the way, to us about utility, about the relativistic nature of utility, because you always have to define it according to what is valued. Classical utilitarianism is based, the value is reduction of harm or increase of happiness or well-being or what have you. But you have to set that initial sort of almost axiomatic, what is it that is useful? What is it that has utility? And so poetry gave the Greeks many things that were useful, that did possess utility, simply towards a value that we wouldn't see or perceive or hold today. So we're going to go back into the passage. Quote, "In those ancient times in which poetry came into existence, the aim was utility, and actually a very great utility. When one lets rhythm permeate speech, the rhythmic force that reorders all the atoms of a sentence, bids one choose one's words with care, and gives one's thoughts a new color, making them darker, stranger, and more remote, the utility in question was superstitious. Rhythm was meant to impress the gods more deeply with the human petition, for it was noticed that men remember a verse much better than ordinary speech. It was also believed that a rhythmic tick-tock was audible over greater distances. A rhythmical prayer was supposed to get closer to the ears of the gods. Above all, men desired the utility of the elemental and overpowering effect that we experience in ourselves as we listen to music. Rhythm is a compulsion. It engenders an unconquerable urge to yield and join in. Not only our feet follow the beat, but the soul does too. Probably one surmised the soul of the gods as well. Thus one tried to compel the gods by using rhythm and to force their hand. Poetry was thrown at them like a magical snare. There was an even stranger notion that may have contributed most of all to the origins of poetry. Among the Pythagoreans, it appears as a philosophical doctrine and an artifice in education, but long before there were any philosophers, music was credited with the power of discharging the emotions, of purifying the soul, of easing the ferocia animi, precisely by means of rhythm. When the proper tension and harmony of the soul had been lost, one had to dance following the singer's beat. That was the prescription of his therapy. That is how Terpander put an end to a riot, how Empedocles soothed a raging maniac, and how Damon purified a youth who was pining away, being in love. And this was also the cure one tried to apply to the gods when the desire for revenge had made them rabid. Above all, one sought to push the exuberance and giddiness of the emotions to the ultimate extreme, making those who were in a rage entirely mad, and the vengeful frenzied with lust for revenge. All orgiastic cults aim at discharging the ferocia of some deity all at once, turning it into an orgy, in order that the deity should feel freer and calmer afterward and leave man in peace. Etymologically, melos is a tranquilizer, not because it is tranquil itself, but because its after effects make one tranquil. It is not only in the cult song, but also in worldly songs of the most ancient times that it is assumed that rhythm has a magical power. As one draws water or rose, for example, a song is supposed to cast a spell over the demons that one imagines at work in such cases. It makes them pliant and unfree so that they become man's instruments. Every action provides an occasion for song. Every action depends on the assistance of spirits, and the magical song and the spell seem to be the primeval form of poetry. Verse also had a function in oracles. The Greeks claimed that the hexameter was invented at Delphi, because here too rhythm was supposed to affect a compulsion. Asking for a prophecy meant originally, according to the etymology of the word that seems most probable to me, to get something determined. One thought that one could compel the future by gaining the favor of Apollo, who was originally taken to be much more than a prescient god. As the formula is pronounced with literal and rhythmical precision, it binds the future. But the formula is an invention of Apollo, who, being the god of rhythm, can bind even the goddesses of fate. End quote. So, the first aspect that Nietzsche invokes of poetry, that gave it utility for the ancient person, is the superstitious belief in the power of words. That the ancients noticed how rhythm impressed words into the human psyche, quite literally through memory, right? By speaking poetically in verse, one commits the words better to their memory. So, the consequent belief following from that is that the same would be true of the gods. The gods are more likely to take note of, to remember your entreaties to them, if you speak them more beautifully, which is to say, to speak them rhythmically, metrically, with each word, each phrasing chosen with care, which gives each expressed sentiment a greater power, a greater weight. The second aspect that Nietzsche brings up, still superstitious, I mean, really all of these are, but it's not quite the power of rhythm to impress into one's memory, but the power of rhythm to make us want to yield and join in to the beat, right? The power of music that just makes you want to dance. The beat of the drum that synchronizes like a march of soldiers. And so consequently, with this belief, the idea that a prayer or a plea to the gods expressed rhythmically reaches a greater distance in the same way, the beat of the drum compels the marchers. You might think of like a long line of soldiers marching over miles and miles and miles, but the rhythmic beat of the drums sort of strings them all along together, links them over a greater distance. But more to the point, the way that the drum compels the marchers might compel the gods to honor your requests. The god might get swept away in your poetic meter, carried off by the sentiments expressed therein. The third aspect that Nietzsche brings up is perhaps the most interesting. We have to think of Nietzsche's extensive work on the Dionysian ritual, and the Dionysian as an aspect of Greek drama, essentially the power of music for altering one's state of mind, for whipping a crowd into a frenzy or a state of ecstasy. We have to remember that music was always a key part of the worship of Dionysus, and this goes all the way back to gods that predate Dionysus, like Cybele, the Lydian earth goddess that Dionysus was said to have been inducted by, who had very similar rites involving drunkenness and drumming and piping and dancing. But here Nietzsche is talking about other incidents of music quite literally changing one's moods. So he gives 3 examples: Terpander, Empedocles, and Damon. Terpander puts an end to a riot, Empedocles soothes a raging maniac, and Damon does the most unrealistic of all of these, in my opinion. He cures a young man's love sickness, which, as we all know, is impossible, without just letting things run their course, right? By musical means or otherwise, though, there's no shortcut for that. But whether we believe these stories or not, Nietzsche offers an explanation. Music itself does not induce tranquility, and here we're using the idea of music in a broader sense than simply speaking of a musical performance. I mean, here it could mean musicality of speech, poetry, or simply speaking lyrically, speaking within a structured rhythm. Music, in fact, is an excitation of the sensations, of the drives, raises them to a fever pitch. But by inducing this excitement, what follows after the discharge of the totality of the feeling is a calmness, in the wake of the feeling finally burning itself out, so to speak. And that's very interesting to consider alongside Nietzsche's denials that tragedy is a catharsis, because what he's describing here is quite literally cathartic. I mean, I'm sure if Nietzsche were here right now, he would argue with me about that. He would say it's different. There's more nuance to it than that. Perhaps he would argue that even if there is a cathartic element, that's not the essence of tragedy, and that point still stands. But he clearly here describes catharsis as one of the utilities of poetic speech, in all but name. The ability to induce that catharsis is in fact useful, to purge a feeling, right? So that one can experience tranquility in the aftermath of it. That is quite literally what catharsis is. So again, this is why Nietzsche is not necessarily a systematic thinker, because sometimes you get the sense that he has all of these insights into human psychology, some of which are contradictory, and he doesn't try to force them to stop being contradictory. He just has his insights, right? Now, there's also two more useful aspects of poetry, useful at least for the ancient person. To those who saw spirits and gods in the entire natural world, poetry could be a kind of enchanting or hypnotizing force to make the natural world obey, submit to the work that you wish to do upon it. And then finally, the power of prophecy, and Nietzsche makes the claim that prophecy was actually the creation of the future rather than a simple telling of the future. Now, personally, I think that's a bit of a controversial claim. I'm not sure that all classicists would agree with Nietzsche. It is interesting because this passage reads as very much philological. Nietzsche is very much getting back to his philological roots when he says, well, that's my understanding of the etymology of the word for prophecy. So Nietzsche is very much thinking along those lines, and that is worth noting and giving him that credit. I'm just not sure if I would agree that the consensus is out that that's the Greek view of things. And in fact, I believe there are other passages where Nietzsche suggests, so, well, the Moira is enthroned even above the gods. So again, another sort of contradictory sentiment, but he expresses it here. We'll just look at this passage in context with itself. By speaking the prophecy, one is summoning the future into existence, which would technically enthrone Apollo and the Delphic oracles even above the Moira. So, if we leave these apparent or real contradictions aside, what we do have in this passage in context is 5 useful functions of musicality and language, rhythm and speech. And those are impressing one's words into the heart of a god, compelling the gods, exciting human emotions, and consequently providing a discharge of those emotions, compelling the natural world, and then finally compelling a certain future to appear. So let's finish the passage. Quote, "In sum, what could have been more useful for the ancient superstitious type of man than rhythm? It enabled one to do anything, to advance some work magically, to force a god to appear, to be near, and to listen, to mold the future in accordance with one's will, to cleanse one's own soul from some excess of anxiety, mania, pity, or vengefulness, and not only one's own soul, but also that of the most evil demon. Without verse, one was nothing. By means of verse, one almost became a god. Such a fundamental feeling can never be erased entirely, and even now, after men have fought against such superstitions for thousands of years, the wisest among us are still occasionally fooled by rhythm, if only insofar as we sometimes consider an idea truer simply because it has a metrical form and presents itself with a divine skip and jump. Isn't it rather amusing that to this day the most serious philosophers, however strict they may be in questions of certainty, still call on what poets have said in order to lend their ideas force and credibility? And yet it is more dangerous for a truth when a poet agrees than when he contradicts it. For, as Homer says, many lies tell the poets." End quote. So, By means of verse, one almost becomes a god. And I think with this sentiment, we come to the really important aspect of what Nietzsche is pointing to, the valuable insight that he's drawing out in this passage, in which he's listing all of these useful things about poetry to the ancient person, essentially in terms of superstitious beliefs that they held. And I mean, I guess it's worth pointing out, in the case of purging the emotions, that might not be such a superstitious belief. It at least seems plausible that poetry could do that, but the examples given are so extreme that it's so fantastical, it's almost magical. And remember earlier in the passage when Nietzsche invoked Pythagoras, the Pythagoreans were a cult who believed that music, and therefore numbers, and numerical relationships, were the basis of all phenomenal reality. That the noumenon, quote-unquote, is music. And that different distances of tension, right? The way that applying tension at different points in a guitar string creates different notes, that's a kind of numerical reality that explains the variegated modifications of nature that we experience out in the world. So the utility given by music, right, is a utility that man found where? In his own beliefs, in his mindset, so to speak. It was a magical belief, a superstitious belief, but by this means, the Greek elevated himself to the status of almost a god. Now, obviously, as flesh and blood organisms, are always aware of our limitations, of the fact that we're not gods. And I mean, even as we so often try in vain to ignore this truth, the awareness of it is always there. But is there some actual advantage, we might ask, to believing oneself to possess the power to compel the world to obey you through speech, through music, effectively through art, and the ability to creatively bind one's sentiments, to creatively compress one's thoughts and feelings into a kind of magical formula by which one could reshape even the very future? Now, as modern people, we would of course ask, is that a genuine utility or was it an imagined utility? I think it's fairly easy to see that an imagined utility can be a genuine one at the same time. A change of attitude can have a genuine effect on your actions and on your behavior. So is Nietzsche saying that by tricking themselves into believing that they were in possession of this reality reshaping power of rhythm, was Nietzsche saying that this was a source of their greatness? This is one of the reasons why those Greeks knew how to live, as he put it in the preface, because they walked the earth believing themselves to be not so vastly different from the divinities, but that they thought themselves as creatures endowed with divine power. And not in the Christian sense of deriving that power from the divine as a mere servant or conduit or something, but as one who might even compel the gods to do something that they might not ordinarily do. Is that attitude something to be celebrated or to be rejected? And at the end of the passage, Nietzsche makes it clear that this belief is an error, right? That even thousands of years of stamping out that superstition has not eliminated this error, that sometimes we allow ourselves to be compelled by an idea simply because it is presented in a beautiful poetic form. And that's obviously a mistake from the standpoint of a sober intellect. And really what Nietzsche is interested in at the end of the passage is the relation between truth and appearance, and the repeated motif throughout his work that poetry is a kind of deception or lie, that it is an act of stopping at the surface and beautifying the surface, of being misled by feelings, of being consumed by that which is most present, which is most readily felt or most readily perceived. And that this function of poetry is indeed detrimental to seeking the truth. The poets lie too much, right? We talked about this a little bit at the end of season 2, the number of passages on poetry in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And Kaufman points this out as well in his footnotes to this section here in the Gay Science. Zarathustra echoes the ancient sentiment that the poets lie, as Homer says, many lies tell the poets. But of course, Homer is a poet, and Nietzsche is a poet. And when Zarathustra conveys that the poets are all liars, he does so through verse, through the metrical power of Nietzsche's dithyrambic style. So Nietzsche is himself a poet, he's a poetic philosopher, a man with a foot in each world, and he's aware of the inherent contradiction between these two worlds. And yet the contradiction is key to his whole project. That Nietzsche is one who seeks the truth and yet lives in appearance. That's his new philosophical orientation. The truth for us can only ever be an appearance, and yet the world as it appears to each of us can never be a universal or eternal truth. And finally, that certain thoughts or insights will always seem paradoxical or contradictory due to the limitations of language, and therefore that they might need to be expressed poetically, which means without precision, without the kind of rigor that somebody like Wittgenstein, writing much later than Nietzsche obviously, might demand in order to designate a statement as being truly meaningful. So, meaningful in a logical sense is what I mean. So there's this compromise between logic and art, or between truth and appearance, thinking and feeling. And so to bring the entire passage around, Nietzsche invokes utility in this passage, but in order to show us something about how even the apparently fantastical elements of human life may have arisen out of what we might call necessity. And we should always ask why a people found it necessary to come to a given belief. And we should construct our understanding of those beliefs from that perspective, rather than taking, for example, a modern understanding of what is useful, the modern concept of utility, which might be based purely on hedonistic calculations. It might be purely materialistic. If we search for that principle in past ages, we're not going to find it, or we might end up imposing it on the mindset of past ages. And then finally, the notion kind of underlying this, that erroneous beliefs can give us something valuable even if it isn't real. And as for where that leaves us, we philosophers of the future, if I may be so bold, are in the position of knowing the contingency of all human beliefs, the error inherent in all such beliefs, while simultaneously realizing that we can't dispense with error. We certainly can't dispense with belief. And we even see these errors in our own behavior, and we see them in ourselves. And so that's sort of what I would draw out of the passage. That's where we're left at the end of this, is yet again perceiving this strange relationship between truth and appearance, art and philosophy, and the way in which you never get out of the appearance, but you never get to sanctify the appearance as a universal truth in the sense that the dogmatist wants to talk about the truth, and that's brought out by the fact that utility might mean something very, very different for different people, based on the Weltanschauung that they've constructed. So let's move on to a much shorter passage, number 85. Quote, "The good and the beautiful artists continually glorify, they do nothing else. All those states and things that are reputed to give man the opportunity to feel good for once, or great, or intoxicated, or cheerful, or well and wise. These select things and states, whose value for human happiness is considered safe and assured, are the artist's objects. Artists always lie in wait to discover such objects and draw them into the realm of art. What I mean is that they are not themselves the appraisers of happiness. Rather, they try to get close to those who make the appraisals, with the utmost curiosity and the urge to utilize these appraisals immediately. Since they have, in addition to this impatience, also the big lungs of heralds and the feet of runners, they are also always among the first to glorify the new good, and they therefore appear to be the first to call it good, to appraise it as good. But this is, as I have said, an error. They are merely quicker and louder than the real appraisers. But who are the real appraisers? The rich and the idle." End quote. So we're not going to spend as much time on this one because I think it concerns a topic I feel we've covered a great deal in the podcast. Not just that art and poetry deceives, but the way that it deceives. The artist glorifies, as Nietzsche says here. In other passages, he talks about how art emphasizes, brings things into the foreground. The classic example is the eulogy. One brings the noble aspects of someone's character into the forefront of their perspective, which inevitably means the other aspects fade into the background. They might still be there, but they're hidden, so to speak. That's how art idealizes and emphasizes and glorifies. But specifically, Nietzsche is talking about the artist's power to glorify things and states which allow man to feel happy or great, or he even says intoxicated. I would say, in a word, Nietzsche is talking about values. At the beginning of the passage, we might have been tempted to say he was speaking about the legislating power of the artist, but the interesting turn in this passage is in saying that the artist is basically a mere herald. We talked about this a little bit in the Halloween episode I did on the repairer of reputations, and in that discussion Mina brought up, I believe it was McLuhan, who argued that the future is written in the present, and that the great artist is simply the person in the present who has the vision to see everything that's happening for what it is, and therefore to see the future as it shall inevitably unfold. So the example in Repairer of Reputations is perhaps Robert Chambers seeing the coming of these authoritarian movements in the Western world, not because he's literally a prophet, but because as a perceptive artist, he can see all the signs and symptoms in the present day, which he can see all the things that if they're allowed to draw their final consequences can only lead to one place or one thing, right? This means that the artist isn't summoning the future. They're merely prophesizing it. And Nietzsche says the true appraisers. So again, language used here definitely points to values because values are ultimately, they're valuations, right? It's the language of appraisement. But Nietzsche says the true appraisers are the rich and the idle. In other words, a leisure class, the parasitical noble class that always establishes itself atop society. That's who really determines and legislates the values. Now, we could take or leave that insight, I think, especially in light of the fact that Nietzsche would later suggest that the philosopher is the legislator of new values, and that he did seem to mean that genuinely, that the philosopher is not just a herald, he actually does legislate. But specifically, he's kind of talking about like a new species of philosopher who is both a philosopher and an artist. He's not merely a priest or a moralist. He's not operating from the perspective that life is bad. And furthermore, consider the previous passage in which, by the oracle making the prophecy, the future is summoned. The future is shaped by words, not merely described by it. So, of course, Nietzsche did say that was an error to believe that about prophecy. But I think by the time of, say, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche would shift gears a bit and suggest that was a very powerful, very laudable error, and he does seem to believe that the philosopher can actually legislate values, a sort of artistic form of philosopher. So, a passage again about art deceives, a bit on how it deceives, and I think with that we'll move on to 86. Quote, "Of the theater, I had strong and elevated feelings again today, and if I could have music and art in the evening, I know very well what sort of music and art I do not want, namely the kind that tries to intoxicate the audience and to force it to the height of a moment of strong and elevated feelings. This kind is designed for those everyday souls who in the evening are not like victors on their triumphal chariots, but rather like tired mules who have been whipped too much by life. What would men of this type know of higher moods if there were no intoxicants and idealistic whips? Hence they have those who enthuse them even as they have their wines. But what are their drinks and their intoxication to me? Does he that is enthusiastic need wine? Rather, he looks with some sort of nausea at the means and mediators that are trying to produce an effect without a sufficient reason, aping the high tide of the soul. What now? One gives the mole wings and proud conceits, before it is time to go to sleep, before he crawls back into his hole. One sends him off into the theater and places large glasses before his blind and tired eyes. Men whose lives are not an action, but a business, sit before the stage and observe strange creatures for whom life is no mere business. That is decent, you say. That is entertaining. That is culture. Well, in that case, I often lack culture. For much of the time, I find this spectacle nauseous. Whoever finds enough tragedy and comedy in himself probably does best when he stays away from the theater. Or if he makes an exception, the whole process, including the theater, the audience, and the poet, will strike him as the really tragic or comical spectacle, while the play that is performed will mean very little to him by comparison. What are the Fausts and Manfreds of the theater to anyone who is somewhat like Faust and Manfred? But it may give him something to think about that characters of that type should ever be brought upon the stage. The strongest ideas and passions brought before those who are not capable of ideas and passions, but only of intoxication, and here they are employed as a means to produce intoxication. Theater and music is the hashish smoking and beetle chewing of the European. Who will ever relate the whole history of narcotica? It is almost the history of culture, of our so-called higher culture." End quote. So the main thing with an aphorism like this is that the modern reader probably won't recognize the territory, so to speak, of exactly what Nietzsche's talking about as regards the theater. Since theater isn't our main form of artistic expression, you may not have read Manfred or Faust. But this complaint of Nietzsche's is actually a rather modern one, I think. You could say it's a sort of timeless complaint about popular art that's being expressed here, and the final lines really drive it home for me. Nietzsche calls the theater a sort of a pure instrument of intoxication, compared to the drugs that bring on a physiological state of intoxication. So the meaning is that popular art has become like a drug. It's a mere dissolution of one's ordinary state of consciousness for the duration of a pleasurable distraction. Art as a pleasurable distraction. And what does that make art into? It makes it into mere entertainment. And when art becomes that, it's no longer the arena of the highest passions and the most sublime inner states. The revelation of all those really profound aspects of human psychology that comes with their magnification. And so while this complaint, I think, is rather easy to understand, it's almost, okay, art that's merely entertaining or a mere distraction is not very good, right? Okay, got it. But the interesting gem from this passage is Nietzsche's insight that men's lives today are not an action but a business. And I think this is one of those moments where we could stand to get a bit maybe pedantic and overly analytical about what we mean by the word action, because there's a sense in which an action is anything that any phenomenon does. And in that sense, pretty much everything is an action, right? I mean, Nietzsche would even go so far as to say that basically we're not even beings, we're doings, that we create this fictive notion of being as an essence that separates the self from the actions, the processes, the movements and dynamics that really constitute what, quote unquote, it is. And so, following from this, to a certain extent, we could say no person is really estranged from action. We're all acting all the time. Even the person whose life is merely a business is carrying out actions. And yes, sure, true, but not interesting, right? Because in this broad sense of the term action, we're not really saying anything other than to reclassify what we're talking about. The interesting thing is if we only place into the category of action those decisions or behaviors which are carried out as a sort of, it's like a demanded consequence of the organism's drives, not as a matter of course dictated by life circumstances or by externalities, right? The various patterns and regulations that push the organism to repeat certain behaviors for the sake of, for example, social or economic utility, whatever the case may be. Remember the beginning of The Gay Science when Nietzsche discusses how selflessness, when promoted as a virtue, is actually in the self-interest of the community, that morality is the herd instinct in the individual, and thus the internalized moral and social rules and the way that guides our behavior is really an expression of the community imposing its will upon the individual, turning individuals into an instrument of a collective. The individual will becomes an instrument of the greater will. And is that bad? Well, that's the norm for human life. How could it be bad? But the fact remains that many of us go through the motions, so to speak, for most of our lives. And we don't really act in the sense of actually having to make a decision. We just sort of respond. We react to stimuli, right? And this is quite aside from whether the will is free, by the way. What we're talking about is whether the impetus for a given decision comes from within or from without. And the vast majority of our lives, someone could easily argue, that basically consists of things that we do because the decision's already been made for us from without. You get up, you commute to your job, you work, you go home, you get married, you have kids, you pick up hobbies, etc. Where's the real decision point in all of this? Well, those decision points certainly exist, but most of our day-to-day life doesn't consist in them, right? Most of daily life is simply a continuation of a life that's already been patterned by millions of demands that were made of you before you were even born in some sense. And so, you follow the social pressure and familial expectation, the whims of your genetics and the morals you've internalized. And oftentimes I think people just realize it would go against their self-interest, their well-being, to cease to be an instrument. So they just let themselves become an instrument because it's more comfortable and pleasant that way. And so again, how many actual life-altering decisions do we make in our daily lives? I mean, over the course of our entire lives, let's say if I were to estimate conservatively, most people can probably count on one hand the number of such decisions they've had to make. But that's, okay, so to get back to the point then, that's exactly why tragedy, for example, was the art form of the nobility, because tragedy is the dramatization of action. Tragedy dramatizes characters who have to make those types of decisions over the course of the drama, deciding, for example, the life or death of their own child. In the case of Agamemnon, who has to make the choice of whether to sacrifice Iphigenia. For someone whose life is hemmed in by all these external pressures and simply continues along in accord with these pressures, I mean, how alien would their world be from the world of Agamemnon? This king who has life and death placed in his hands. The lives of thousands and thousands of people, not just his daughter, are hinging on his decision. So that's really the interesting thing that comes out of this passage is the the idea that most people's lives are bereft of action. And yet, when they go to the theater, they want to go see these characters take action, right? A final thing that comes to mind, actually, that might help with this. There's a passage from Donna Tartt, The Secret History. This is the main character, Richard, narrating here. But he says that in our modern language, we cannot really capture the essence of Greek, that it is untranslatable. Why? Well, he says that English, quote, fails me utterly when I attempt to describe in it what I love about Greek, that language innocent of all quirks and cranks, a language obsessed with action, and with the joy of seeing action multiply from action marching relentlessly ahead, end quote. So, the world of Greek drama is a world created by active people who are, as Tartt says, obsessed with action, fixated on the dramatic point at which the hero has to make that definitive, irrevocable decision. But today we no longer speak the same language, quite literally. Ours is a language whose driving force is an essentialized subject and whose sentences crescendo with the object that the subject affects. Why is that? Perhaps most of us, as more domesticated human beings, are not accustomed to action, at least not as much. We are more used to our lives being run as a business, right? Maybe we're simply not able to be moved by tragedy in the same way. We don't have the same communion with these displays of the passions, the torment and indecision and terror and madness that drives action. Real action, not a mere going with the flow. And so what do the arts become for us in the modern day? They become mere entertainment. They become, again, a distraction for those who simply want to drop out of their tedious lives for a few hours. And Nietzsche's making another critique of his modern culture. And in that respect, this passage, I guess you could say it's rather unremarkable because we've heard all of that before from Nietzsche, but the insight into the essentially reactive nature of modern life, the fact that we're therefore alienated from active characters, I think that's very important. I wanted to at least draw out that aspect of this passage. Let's go to 87. Quote, of the vanity of artists, I believe that artists often do not know what they can do best because they are too vain and have fixed their minds on something prouder than those small plants seem to be that really can grow in their soil to perfection and are new, strange, and beautiful. They do not think much of what is actually good in their own garden or vineyard, and their love and insight are not of the same order. Here is a musician who, more than any other musician, is a master at discovering the tones out of the realm of suffering, depressed, tormented souls, and at giving speech even to dumb animals. Nobody equals him in the colors of late fall, the indescribably moving happiness of the last, very briefest enjoyment. He finds sounds for those secret and uncanny midnights of the soul in which cause and effect appear to be unhinged, and at any moment something can come into being out of nothing. More happily than anyone else, he draws from the very bottom of human happiness, as it were, from its drained cup, where the bitterest and most repulsive drops have merged in the end, for better or for worse, with the sweetest. He knows how souls drag themselves along when they can no longer leap and fly, nor even walk. His is the shy glance of concealed pain, of understanding without comfort, of farewells without confessions. As the Orpheus of all secret misery, he is greater than anyone, and he has incorporated in art some things that had previously seemed to be inexpressible and even unworthy of art, as if words could only frighten them away, not grasp them. Very small, microscopic features of the soul. Yes, he is the master of the very small. But that is not what he wants to be. His character prefers large walls and audacious frescoes. He fails to see that his spirit has a different taste and urge, and likes best of all to sit quietly in the nooks of houses that have collapsed. There, concealed from himself, he paints his real masterpieces, all of which are very short, often only a single measure in length. There he becomes wholly good, great, and perfect, perhaps only there. But he does not know it. He is too vain to know it. End quote. This aphorism is about an artist's inclinations being at variance with his talents, and Kaufmann in his footnote suggests that Nietzsche is speaking about Wagner. Kaufmann cross-references the passage with another in case of Wagner, in which Nietzsche says, quote, Wagner is one who has suffered deeply, that is his distinction above other musicians, end quote. And so, to explain this, we might just think of Nietzsche's numerous remarks about Wagner as a magician-like figure, a man who plays on the heartstrings. Wagner is sort of manipulative with his art in that way, that Wagner begins from a certain state he wishes to induce, like a certain scene. A scene here meaning a total construction with the music, the characters, the feeling, the total effect, right? He imagines the total effect that he wants to impact the audience with, and then he constructs his operas in order to string together this series of affects. And another comment that Nietzsche makes is that if we were to put all of Wagner's characters side by side in a series, it's like the inmates of a psych ward. These are the representations of a pathological inner state, right? A feeling or sense impression so strong that it becomes domineering. And so another thing that Nietzsche says, the next sentence that Kaufmann quotes from is, quote, "I admire Wagner whenever he puts himself to music," end quote. And so the sense we can get from this passage in The Gay Science would be that if we take it to be about Wagner, it would be when Wagner allows himself to express what is actually within him, to really be an artist, which means to put himself to music, to commit his inner life to music, his own inner states. He's an artist who beautifully expresses suffering. That is his talent. But he covers this over by becoming the magician. And this could perhaps describe the dynamic that Nietzsche is explaining in this passage. A man who could be a master of the very small, who sees all those smallest details of the soul, finds beauty in all those little moments. He can draw from the bottom of the cup of human happiness, in which every sweet drop is mixed with the bitter dregs of disappointment. That talent is itself the making of a great artist. But that's not who he wants to be, in spite of the fact that that is his talent. And how many artists get drawn into creating, some grandiose world-embracing artistic project that addresses itself to all of life and the universe and everything, when really their talents would be better expressed in some other way. And, I would say it's just actually very common in general. I mean, the passage is called On the Vanity of Artists, and all of this that we've just considered is, in effect, we could think about it as a proof for the first claim in this passage, that artists don't know themselves. So the argument would be, look at how vain artists really are, based on the fact that they possess this inadequate self-awareness of where their strengths and weaknesses are. That's a perennial problem among artists. It's one of the hardest things about being in a band, for example. When you have a member that doesn't want to play to their strengths. It's a very insightful thing from Nietzsche. So many artists want to be something that they really aren't. I can't tell you how many bass players I've played with, especially in the early days, who, they listen to Les Claypool and Flea and they get completely ruined by that and they forget what their role is as a bass player. So they're trying to be a virtuoso, or they're trying to mimic a virtuoso whose level of playing and just whole level of creative expression with the instrument is on a different level. So it really just another passage reminding us that artists are pretty bad at the whole self-awareness thing. That would be the summary of the passage. But there is some very interesting, perhaps biographical details if we take it to be about Wagner, as Kaufmann thinks it is. Let's move on to 88. Quote, "Being serious about truth. Being serious about truth, what very different ideas people associate with these words. The very same views and types of proof and scrutiny that a thinker may consider a frivolity in himself, to which he has succumbed on this or that occasion to his shame, these very same views may give an artist who encounters them and lives with them for a while the feeling that he has now become deeply serious about truth, and that it is admirable how he, although an artist, has at the same time the most serious desire for the opposite of mere appearance. Thus it can happen that a man's emphatic seriousness shows how superficial and modest his spirit has been all along when playing with knowledge. And does not everything that we take seriously betray us? It always shows what has weight for us and what does not." End quote. So Nietzsche's being a bit vague here. We have to go out on a limb in order to interpret him, I think. But he has this sentiment in the middle of the passage. Sometimes there are some views, some types of proof that a thinker might consider frivolity. So what does it mean to be frivolous? Trivial, superficial, meaningless, however we want to take it. What would that mean? A type of proof, so a way of knowing, which is frivolous, meaningless, inadequate, etc., but which a thinker might occasionally succumb to. What does Nietzsche mean here? One way of interpreting this might be that, for example, faith is a way of knowing, quote unquote. It's a way of knowing that the thinker considers frivolous, but all the same. That doesn't mean he doesn't occasionally succumb to that way of thinking, though, that he doesn't occasionally make faith-based decisions, which Nietzsche says occasions some shame on the part of the thinker. And what clues us in, I think, is the way in which he says that if an artist experienced a similar thought, came to a similar view of the world through one of these faulty ways of knowing, they wouldn't be ashamed of it the way the thinker is. They would think instead, wow, even as an artist, I'm one of these types who works in the realm of appearance, but look at me, I'm penetrating to the truth behind the appearance. Isn't that amazing, right? So the ways of knowing which are obviously faulty to the thinker, and to shame him when he does fall victim to them, are the very ways of knowing that seduce artists, seduce them into thinking they've breached mere appearance. And this may be to oversimplify what Nietzsche is saying to some extent, but I think artists are more susceptible to proofs of the heart, or proof by intuition, which can be valuable ways of knowing, I should add. I mean, I personally have always been bad at trusting my intuition. I'm skeptical, and I'm always skeptical. I'm always raising doubts toward my own intuition along with everything else. That's a side of me that's similar to the type that Nietzsche is here calling the thinker. But I also clearly have an artistic side, and I know there's something really powerful about an idea just feeling right. A viewpoint on reality is validated, so to speak, by the pleasure it gives you, or by the feeling or the intuition that there's a numinous quality to the belief, to the idea, maybe something you can't even put into words. And so the passage is called Being Serious About Truth. So what does that mean? Nietzsche's point is that it can mean very different things to different people who have a different modus vivendi, or different sensibilities, a different moral code associated with their way of knowing. And that's an important point that's raised throughout the entirety of Nietzsche's canon. The way we check our beliefs or test them or validate them is often by cross-referencing the idea against how it makes us feel and how we think it would make others feel. And this is according to a moral formula of what is correct and incorrect to believe. And that might seem like an obvious point, but there are always intellectuals sort of trying to claw back the truth, claw it back from the reality of social consensus that actually determines what's considered true and false. And Nietzsche is always keying us into this. So here, even the premise of his observation is that we might have a sense of shame associated with a way of knowing. So the scientific materialist, even though he would likely not frame his outlook morally, feels he has a sort of obligation, a duty to ignore proofs by feeling, to accept beliefs about reality that are based on something more than gut instinct, we'll say. Whereas somebody coming from a completely different culture or subculture, a different class consciousness maybe, or a different Weltanschauung, will have a different moral obligations imposed on the kinds of beliefs that he feels he can entertain. And so we might have two people who believe the same thing, but for one of them the belief is a shame, an embarrassment, something that they see as a weakness of theirs, holding that belief, versus another person who sees the same belief as the most agreeable and virtuous idea that one could submit themselves to. And so the final remarks in this passage, I think, bring us back to that level of analysis. A man's emphatic seriousness shows us what he values. It shows us what has weight for him, and thus what does not have weight for him. Wherever we stop and become serious, that betrays us, so to speak. It reveals the sentimentality, the valuations, and thus the arbitrariness and the instincts behind all of our consciously articulated beliefs and our proofs, so to speak. So with that, let's move on to number 89. Quote, "Now and formerly, what good is all the art of our works of art if we lose that higher art, the art of festivals? Formerly, all works of art adorned the great festival road of humanity to commemorate high and happy moments. Now one uses works of art to lure aside from the great Via Dolorosa of humanity those who are wretched, exhausted, and sick, and to offer them a brief, lustful moment, a little intoxication, and madness." End quote. So, in a way, this ties back to the earlier passage we looked at about the modern theater as a kind of narcotic or a distraction. That's what Nietzsche means by our works of art luring us aside from the great Via Dolorosa, the road of suffering. So those who are sick and unhealthy or exhausted, right, the products of the modern world, are offered an anesthetic. And that's what passes for modern art. And how far is this from the conception of the festival in ancient times, the celebration of life? Art as a drug it's like something that brings you back up to normal, up to the baseline, from being below the baseline. You're in like a wretched state, and the drug, like the opiate-like version of art that Nietzsche's describing, the mere distraction, brings you back up to normal. Whereas Nietzsche invokes the idea of the festival as the artistic kind of celebration that takes us from normal up into an appearance of true ecstasy. So it's not a momentary intoxication. It's not just momentary frenzy to deal with the pain of civilized life, but a true elevation of human life, an elevation of passion and instinct, an elevation of the whole panoply of human experience. And that's a key distinction, I think, that's so easy to lose in the way that people interpret, for instance, Birth of Tragedy and the role of the Dionysian. It almost seems at times like Nietzsche is trying almost too hard to make the Dionysian transcend any kind of conventional explanation for why we enjoy tragedy, right? It's not catharsis. It's not a momentary release. It's not a mere return to the animal. It's not an insensible ritual, and so on. And, I just said he's almost trying too hard, but I think part of the reason why, is that when you give an explanation like that, you're kind of trying to just like bundle the Greek Dionysian rituals and the Greek dramas into some sort of like easily understandable and digestible category, and then we think we can have done with it. And, I think Nietzsche wants to avoid that. He doesn't want to make this, I don't know, he wants to keep the numinous quality of the Dionysian. And there's an element of the Dionysian that Nietzsche, I would say, basically struggles to illuminate. He struggles to do so as clearly as he can throughout his entire career. He's always kind of moving towards this. It's the Dionysian as synonymous with life affirmation. And I almost hate to use that term because it's so sedate, but we mean life affirmation here as a kind of active, affirmative assertion of the value of physical life in the full perception of what that means. So it's not just intoxicated self-forgetting. There's a kind of perception in the Dionysian of the total picture of nature, the samsaric totality of nature, the primordial pain and contradiction, which is to say, life is always moving, always desiring, always dissatisfied, and therefore always fighting and struggling. And that's basically the defining character of life, this wheel of devouring and reproducing and desiring. And then to then really embrace life affirmation is to sort of affirm that whole thing and affirm oneself as a part of that, it's a really powerful idea, and it's almost impossible to defend on any philosophical or logical basis. It can only really be affirmed on an aesthetic basis as a creative and arbitrary act of affirmation, we might say. So to return to art, what good is all of our art if we lose the art of festivals? Meaning, what good is our capacity for creativity, for non-rational creativity, necessarily non-rational, if we cannot create that which elevates mankind, not merely raises him from some wretched state into a marginally more tolerable state, but brings him from that merely tolerable state into a state in which he can actively affirm life, affirm a worldly existence. And so you can read this as a statement from Nietzsche about the real utility of art. We need art insofar as some exceptional works of art uplift us into a new view of existence. But I even hesitate at sort of capping off my my exegesis of the passage there, because there is some aspect of the festival which is, I wouldn't want to think of it in terms of a work of art so much as an experience of art. That art really must be seen as a communion, as an experience, as an action, as something active and happening and moving. And that's, I think, art as drama, it's much easier to conceptualize that way. I don't think Nietzsche is really talking about art in an objectified form here. So that caveat is worth mentioning as well. So that's how I would interpret this passage. Let's go on to 90. Quote, "Lights and shadows. Books and drafts mean something quite different for different thinkers. One collects in a book the lights he has been able to steal and carry home swiftly out of the rays of some insight that suddenly dawned on him, while another thinker offers us nothing but shadows, images in black and gray of what had built up in his soul the day before." End quote. I think this one is fairly straightforward, and it's a nice little poetic sentiment of Nietzsche's. I don't think it bears that much explanation. I mean, we might simply ask, who are those authors that we might consider as though they steal many little lights, as in collecting small insights? And who are those who offer us shadows from that darkness that's built up in their soul? So that's sort of like a constellating, bright type of mind versus the darkness of the soul, the heart, right? I think it's McLuhan again who said, everyone experiences more than he understands, but it's experience and not understanding that influences behavior. And so I would say most fiction writers, most novelists, most poets are probably of the latter variety of people who sort of write out of the inner shadow, who experience a great deal without perhaps consciously understanding it. And I would say nonfiction writers, philosophy writers, logicians, they're probably going to be more similar to the former type. And I guess the really interesting figures would be people like, well, I mean, Nietzsche himself, who seems to me to write more like the latter type, more like a poet, showing us some of the wisdom that he has naturally, insensibly taken in, wisdom from the heart, right? And yet he writes philosophy. It's a very interesting, almost mismatch of Nietzsche's style versus his chosen path in life. Let's go on to number 91, quote, "Caution. As is well known, Alfieri told a great many lies when he told his surprised contemporaries the story of his life. What prompted these lies was the same despotic attitude toward himself that he also manifested in the way in which he created his own language and tyrannically forced himself to become a poet. He had finally found a severe form of sublimity into which he then pressed his life and his memory. No doubt there was much agony in all of this. I also would not believe a biography of Plato written by himself any more than Rousseau's or the Vita Nuova of Dante." End quote. This is another one that I think bears very little comment. Nietzsche says, "I would not believe an autobiography of Plato any more than I would believe one of Dante or Rousseau." And he mentions Vittorio Alfieri, and he says, he obviously told many lies in his own memoirs, which is the main source we have for his life, by the way. And Nietzsche doesn't elaborate on why he doesn't trust this selection of men. He does simply entitle the passage "Caution." So one could interpret this as a general caution, a caution against taking what writers or philosophers have to say about themselves. Or perhaps there is something that unites all of these figures that Nietzsche mentions. I mean, we know what Nietzsche thinks of Plato and Rousseau, that they're idealists. Arguably, we could say the same thing about Dante. In Alfieri's case, he was a prideful man who was intent upon becoming a famous playwright, and he had a great ambition and apparently a somewhat irritable and domineering attitude. But according to his own memoirs, he managed to soften his prideful characteristics, and he reports that he eventually became a generous man who was beloved by his family and friends, and that in fact he became in some way comparable to the Greek heroes that he dramatized. Well, if we take Alfieri's word for it, I mean, that's one thing. But if we consider the source, we might be suspicious. We might say that maybe Alfieri is a kind of idealist about his own character. And so you could interpret this passage a couple of ways, but the note of caution in trusting what thinkers have to say about themselves and their lives and who they really are, I think that's all well taken. We should always be suspicious of how these intellectuals narrativize their own lives. And I'm looking at you too, Nietzsche, as, we see in Ecce Homo. And I've done it too. I mean, in my book, I narrativize my own life. I made myself the protagonist in a story that I chose to invest with all this meaning. And, you can bet that the details I choose to talk about and the ones that I don't are chosen, sometimes carefully. And that's probably true of any autobiographical work. Our vanity as artists demands it. Remember that in Human All Too Human, a couple of books before this, before The Gay Science, there's quite a lot of writing on vanity, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go cross-reference some of that discussion there with what Nietzsche says regarding the vanity of the artist in these passages. And then also go and read La Rochefoucauld's Moral Maxims, what he has to say about self-love. Let's go to 92. Quote, "Prose and poetry. It is noteworthy that the great masters of prose have almost always been poets too. If not publicly, then at least secretly, in the closet. Good prose is written only face to face with poetry, for it is an uninterrupted, well-mannered war with poetry, All of its attractions depend on the way in which poetry is continually avoided and contradicted. Everything abstract wants to be read as a prank against poetry, and as with a mocking voice, everything dry and cool is meant to drive the lovely goddess into lovely despair. Often there are reproachments, reconciliations for a moment, and then a sudden leap back and laughter. Often the curtain is raised, and a harsh light let in just as the goddess is enjoying her dusks and muted colors. Often the words are taken out of her mouth and sung to a tune that drives her to cover her refined ears with her refined hands. Thus there are thousands of delights in this war, including the defeats of which the unpoetic souls, the so-called prose men, do not know a thing. Hence they write and speak only bad prose. War is the father of all good things. War is also the father of good prose. End quote. So there's that Apollo-Dionysus relationship echoing in Nietzsche's head once again. Another way of getting at this would be that key difference between the lying poet and the thinker who really has this kind of obligation to try and see and describe the world the way it quote-unquote really is. So we have Socrates versus Homer. We have the theoreticians versus the artist, the devotee of truth versus the person willingly intoxicated by art. That is what is the relationship between prose and poetry is like. The prose author is in a constant war, constant tension with poetry, because poetry represents a huge power, and poetry, in a way, paves the way for prose. Men had to speak poetically. They had to speak rhythmically before they could learn to write in prose. So poetry, it's very Dionysian in that way, right? It's the bleeding edge. It's the burning, the pyroclastic flow before it's hardened and become rigidified. And so if you allow your work of prose to become totally taken over by poetry, I mean, it becomes like Finnegan's Wake, where it's almost incomprehensible. Loses sight of the narrative. It's almost, the narrative collapses, and the objective facts of the story, any pacing or logic, that all kind of falls away, and it becomes a series of scenes and sensations. But if your prose contains nothing of poetry, well, then I don't know. It's like that's what you'd expect out of like a technical manual or something to that effect. It's not really prose anymore, even. I mean, even a college essay on epistemology or another like dry topic, right? A good essay is going to contain something of the poetic, something of the lyrical, some attention to how a phrase is turned and how the paragraph flows. And I think it's true. It's a constant tension, but it's a productive tension. And so that's another hallmark of Nietzsche's thought here, the productive tension between the prose and poetry of language. And then finally, we have the citation of Heraclitus as a kind of proof of the idea that war is the father of all things, as Nietzsche puts it here, all good things. And I just want to say I love the second half of this paragraph. I have very little comment on it philosophically, because what I love about it is the writing, where, perhaps what Nietzsche is doing here is demonstrating exactly what he means by doing what he says is needed for good prose. He basically leaps into poetry at the end of the paragraph. He weaves all these beautiful sentences where he's describing this sort of goddess that is sort of, we might take to be the muse. And he says everything abstract is like a prank against poetry, a reproachment, right? So he's speaking abstractly here in a sense, because the category of, everything abstract, that is itself an abstraction, I guess. But he immediately concretizes it by giving us a mental image of a prank, a reproachment, a kind of playful war. The abstract writer, the person writing the driest possible essay on Heidegger that they can produce, or whatever the case may be, is actually a kind of prankster or a trickster, which is a very funny way of talking about it. But I don't know. I enjoy the way that he sort of lapses into poetry himself with all of these sentences about the goddess. Let's return to the text and finish out this passage. Quote, "Four very strange and truly poetic human beings in this century have attained mastery in prose, for which this century was not made otherwise, for lack of poetry, as I have suggested. Not including Goethe, who may be fairly claimed by the century that produced him, I regard only Giacomo Leopardi, Prosper Mérimée, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Walter Savage Landor, the author of Imaginary Conversations, as worthy of being called masters of prose." End quote. And the reason I broke this up isn't, I don't really have further comment on this part. I just wanted to say that we've talked about the main ideas of the passage. This part of section 92 is useful because all of these figures are figures you should take note of. They could all well be the subjects of future episodes. I mean, actually, some of them we've already spoken about, including Goethe and Emerson, and we're certainly going to talk about Leopardi one day. I'm just not sure when. I've honestly thought about doing an episode on Leopardi since the first season of the podcast. I've just never really gotten around to it because it always seemed like I had more pressing topics, or it just never made it into the schedule. But in any case, whenever Nietzsche lists off writers like he does in this passage, I think it's worth taking note of, and you should look into reading those writers yourself, right? It'll inform your understanding of Nietzsche when you see, for example, in Emerson, many of the ideas that Nietzsche would go on to elucidate in his own work, presented in a different language and in a different form, so to speak. So that's really my only comment here. Let's go on to number 93. Quote, "But why do you write? A. I am not one of those who think with an inky pen in their hand, much less one of those who in front of an open inkwell abandon themselves to their passions while they sit in a chair and stare at the paper. I am annoyed by and ashamed of my writing. Writing is for me a pressing and embarrassing need, and to speak of it even in a parable disgusts me. B. But why then do you write? A. Well, my friend, to be quite frank, so far I have not discovered any other way of getting rid of my thoughts. B. And why do you want to get rid of them? A. Why I want to. Do I want to? I must. B. Enough. End quote. So there's an old koan in the Zen tradition, which goes like this. Why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Sometimes phrased as, why did the first patriarch come to China? Why did the first patriarch come from the West? Meaning here, India. In other words, why did Bodhidharma, the founder of the Zen school, come to China and found a school? The core teachings of Zen involve the idea that there is, in fact, nothing to teach about Zen, nothing to be learned about it, no words or letters that can elucidate it, and that there's nothing to attain, nothing to get in the course of Zen teaching. So why did Bodhidharma come? Why establish a school that teaches nothing? Because on the principle that no one can really teach anything. And numerous times throughout the Zen canon, there are instances of Zen masters asking students and one another this question. It's one of the standard kind of testing questions of the Zen tradition. Why did the first patriarch come from the West? Meaning, if you truly get it, that there's nothing to be attained, we're not working toward any goal here, we're not teaching or learning or practicing anything, then what are we doing exactly? What is the point of teaching that there is no point? And obviously, again, as I've said, the whole Zen transmission is supposed to be outside of words and letters, so there's really no answer to this question. There can't be an orthodox canonical answer because there's going to be a logical contradiction any way that you slice it, right? And so the answer is almost, that's the famous thing about Zen, it almost verges into Dada or absurdism. The answers that people will give to this question are complete non sequiturs or metaphors or poetic utterances and so on. So to tie this to Nietzsche and to this aphorism, I think it's fitting. It's like a koan. Why do you write? It's a question for us, the Nietzscheans. Why did Nietzsche write books? Because from Nietzsche's perspective, we always hold the beliefs that we do and the ideas that we have and the worldview that we come to out of necessity, the necessity of who and what we are. And so, for example, there's that famous passage in Twilight of Idols in The Four Great Errors where he says, the church thinks that society declines because people embrace hedonistic lifestyles of vice and luxury. Basically, they've made bad moral choices, bad moral decisions. Nietzsche says, no, those hedonistic lifestyles are a symptom of society's decline. And so often where we see an idea or where we see a worldview as being the cause of some event or the cause of some change in society, Nietzsche says that idea is a post hoc rationalization. There was some instinct or physiological drive at the root of that event, that action, and the consciousness, the intellect, then rationalizes why it did what it did. So one would be justified then in asking, why write books? especially if you believe your ideas are not for everyone, that those who have a right to your ideas will be the ones to embrace them, and they'll sound like follies to everyone else. Well, from that perspective, Nietzsche would be forced to say that when he is read, he is always either falling on deaf ears or preaching to the choir, that the books themselves don't do anything. They don't actually effectively change hearts and minds, because if a book by Nietzsche could change your mind, there must have already been something in you that caused that change, that made you susceptible to Nietzsche in the first place. And that's putting it very cynically, but I think that makes the point, that one could seriously question whether Nietzsche is really doing anything in publishing his works. He certainly can't claim to be advancing the human species in the way that Hegel conceived he was doing, or Kant might have believed he was doing for philosophy. I mean, based on the very arguments Nietzsche has made about history as cyclical, instinct as the driving motor of society, war as inevitable, and so on, how could Nietzsche's books really... How could the act of writing be an active and productive thing for him? And we might therefore have to conclude that the best Nietzsche can do is to simply describe the process of advancing the species, but he doesn't actually affect the process at all. That according to Nietzsche's way of thinking, it's like the opposite of Marx, right? Marx, the principle of every philosopher has tried to describe history, but the point is to change it. Nietzsche's philosophy could be interpreted as saying, philosophy, every philosopher has tried to change history, but philosophy doesn't actually change history. So why does Nietzsche write? Well, his explanation here is pretty much in line with this very type of thinking. I write because I have to, for the reason that you can't change what's going to play out according to the tension and clash between instincts. You can't change the fact that I write books out of instinct, that dispensing with my thoughts, getting rid of my thoughts through writing them out, is simply something that I feel a kind of internal imperative to do. I don't have a choice in the matter. But it's worth saying, we don't actually know if this character in the passage actually represents Nietzsche himself, because he phrases this as A and B talking to one another. It's not phrased as his own sentiments. And so is this just a way of veiling his own feelings behind plausible deniability? Because the speaker in the section says, I'm ashamed and embarrassed of the thoughts I commit to writing. I simply have to write, however. Is that how Nietzsche feels? Maybe he's just describing a certain type, if not necessarily himself. But I think what is said at the end is universally applicable. That at the end of the day, when you ask an artist why they create art, you will get an answer like this, usually. I must. Not I want, but I must. And sometimes it can actually be painful, this compulsion to make art. It's caused a lot of friction in my own life at times. But as what does Lopan say? He's talking about romance, but it's in Big Trouble in Little China, where he says, we all keep on trying like fools. Let's go on to number 94. This is an aphorism about Fontenelle. And Fontenelle is one of the French authors that Nietzsche counted among his list of 6 authors that he gives in, I believe that was Wanderer and His Shadow. 6 French authors he considered to be closer to the classical world, like the feeling of the Renaissance and the classical world, closer to the ancient world than any German writer ever to exist, I believe is the context of that passage. Fontenelle is one of those 6. And then in the next aphorism after this one, in 95, it's about Chamfort, who is also on that list. And I'm going to admit from the outset my own deficiency in either of these authors. It's been a long time since I've read either of them, right? But we're going to go through the aphorisms, and I'll discuss a little bit of Kaufman's comments explaining some of the background on these figures, and then I'll mainly just disentangle any of the philosophical threads that I think aren't eminently obvious. So this is 94, quote, growth after death. Those audacious little words about moral questions that Fontenelle threw out in his immortal Dialogues of the Dead were considered in his own time as mere paradoxes and games of a not inconsiderable wit. Even the highest arbiters of taste and spirit found nothing more here, and perhaps Fontenelle himself did not. Now something incredible happens. These thoughts become realities. Science proves them. The game becomes serious. And now we read these dialogues with very different feelings than Voltaire and Helvetius did, and automatically we promote their author to another, much higher rank in the hierarchy of spirits. rightly or wrongly, end quote. So in the footnotes, I'm just going to read what Kaufmann writes, quote, "It is far from obvious what Nietzsche might mean, and his other references to Fontenelle provide no clue. What Nietzsche has in mind is presumably the theme that truth is unattainable, that errors are required for life, and that the conviction that truth can be discovered by man is itself an error. These ideas turn up in the witty repartee of the dialogues, and now seem to Nietzsche to have been proved. To put the point very succinctly, by Kant and Darwin, Kant showed in his Critique of Pure Reason that the world of our experience is not ultimate reality, and Darwin's Origin of the Species placed Kant's ideas in a new perspective." End quote. That was quoting from Kaufmann's footnote here. And then he has a couple passages from Fontenelle's dialogues. For example, part 3, dialogue number 4, quote, "Ah, you don't yet know how folly serves us. It keeps us from knowing ourselves. For the sight of oneself is very sad, and since it is never good to know oneself, it would not do for folly to leave men even for a single moment." End quote. Let's go to part 5, dialogue 2, quote, "One must have before one's eyes an imaginary goal that gives one an incentive. One would lose courage if one were not sustained by false ideas. If by some misfortune the truth were to show itself as it is, all would be lost. But it seems to grasp very well the importance of always remaining well concealed," end quote. Let's do part 4, dialogue 4, quote, "One has some reason for always being deceived with the promises of the philosophers. From time to time they discover some small truths of no consequence that, however, provide some entertainment. But regarding the essentials of philosophy, I submit that there is scarcely any advance. I believe that occasionally one finds the truth about points that matter, but the trouble is that one does not know that one has found it," end quote. And as Kaufmann notes, that last remark is put into the mouth of Descartes. The dialogues of the dead, well, I guess I'll explain what they are. They're conversations between philosophical figures from sort of like across ages and time periods. So, for example, there's like a dialogue between Socrates and Montaigne. And if you think about this in reference to Nietzsche's own work, a few books before this aphorism, or before this book, The Gay Science, in that aphorism, Journey to Hades, we did a whole episode about that, Nietzsche there says, "I too have been to the underworld. There I found 4 pairs of thinkers who did not deny me, who revealed to me everything of who they were, and from them I permitted myself to accept judgment, both on myself and on my ideas, and I permitted them to pass judgment on one another." Notice Nietzsche's phrasing, "I too have been to the underworld." He references Odysseus. He says he's like Odysseus in that he's been to the underworld, but we might think maybe he also meant somebody like Fontenelle, right? And all the other classicist thinkers who delved into the minds and souls of long-dead writers and thinkers, looking to commune with minds from ages past. But in any case, the passage is called Growth After Death, which I think we can take to mean the meaning of Fontenelle's work has grown after his death. And the interesting philosophical idea here in Fontenelle is the notion that's also found in Voltaire: error has its merits too. We need our follies. We're served by false ideas. These ideas are distinctly Nietzschean, or usually considered to be, but here Nietzsche is simply he's showing his hand. He's giving us a citation of where he found inklings of this idea previously. He's showing us his influences. And Kaufmann's interpretation of Nietzsche's statements here is that the work of the scientific Enlightenment has really ultimately proven Fontenelle's dialogues of the dead to be correct. It's been demonstrated by Kant and by Darwin. The Critique of Pure Reason and Darwin's revelation, where we're not souls created by an all-knowing God, imbued us with the aim of discovering the truth, that in fact our existence may be simply based on survival, on nourishment and reproduction, and fitness toward this goal, and that discovery of the truth may only come incidentally to this goal. Now, I do think this interpretation of Kaufmann's is a bit shaky. I see where he's coming from. I would probably not cite those same 2 thinkers to make the same point, but I see what he's saying. Perhaps Nietzsche does mean to refer to the value of folly in this passage. But perhaps Nietzsche is saying that Fontenelle has been proved in his assertions by science, insofar as, Fontenelle's Socrates says that there are just as many wise men in every century. The implicit idea beneath the dialogues of the dead is that the archetypal philosopher is a kind of rare, eternal type. And perhaps Nietzsche sees something of the Emersonian idea of the oversoul, very important influence on him as well. These archetypal forms sort of repeating eternally in different iterations. That would also seem to be somewhat similar to Schopenhauer, his idea of the gradations of the will being similar or analogous to Plato's eternal forms. And so there might be something under this passage of like the eternal return of the same, the absence of any progress in history or progress over time. That's what Schopenhauer felt he had come to discover, much to his chagrin with life. But Nietzsche might say, eternal return is now being shown to be the most scientific of all hypotheses. That's what he writes in his notes. And he sees this in the work of Boscovich and others, mixed in with Nietzsche's own idiosyncratic understanding of the sciences. And, Nietzsche basically comes to a similar conclusion as Schopenhauer, but he says, I affirm this life in which nothing is improved, nothing progresses. All we have are extraordinary lives that come along every so once in a while, and these are just, in some sense, eternal repeating archetypes. So, I don't know. Explaining this further, I feel it would take us too far afield, where Nietzsche is making these really bold claims, these really grandiose claims that eternal return is the most scientific of all hypotheses, right? But you could maybe read this passage. I almost just wanted to give an example of like a different way you could read the passage, because I don't know if this is the proper way to interpret the passage either, but I think it's plausible, and I think it's just worth providing a counter explanation, because while Kaufmann may be right, I think there are many possible ways to interpret what Nietzsche's saying here. And therefore, I think really the main note to take away is that Nietzsche is inviting you to read Fontenelle, not simply absorb his interpretation of Fontenelle. I think he's being a bit mysterious in order to entice us to go see what's in Fontenelle's work. But I will say, the other aspect that's interesting about this passage is that final sentiment, that after the fact, Fontenelle was proven right, whatever Nietzsche thinks he was proven right about, and that raises the value of his spirit in our eyes. Does that happen rightly or wrongly? He was right, but he wasn't actually justified, right? I'm trying to think of the name for this, but it's like if knowledge is justified true belief, you might hold a true belief based on a way of knowing doesn't actually justify the belief. And so did you actually really know it? And so if you knew something was going to happen, like you say, like let's say you have some sort of superstitious belief that, I saw 4 birds flying east in the sky, that means it's going to rain tomorrow, and then it actually rains tomorrow. That would, if the community all starts listening to you and taking your decisions, was that all right? Was that to rightly raise the value of your judgments, or was it to wrongly do so? So that would be what I would kind of consider that Nietzsche might be pointing out. Okay, let's just take Kaufmann's interpretation that Fontenelle knew intuitively, or he felt he's just simply felt that folly was something that mankind ought to be grateful for. But now, because of the work of Kant and Darwin, we really truly know it to be true. And so did Fontenelle really have justification for his belief? Were we really correct in elevating the value of Fontenelle's spirit? This is why I am a little suspicious of Kaufmann's interpretation, by the way, because that whole proposition doesn't seem to be something that really needs to be proved scientifically, and I don't think Nietzsche would say that we needed Kant and Darwin to prove that mankind needs folly in order to live. I think it's more likely that there is something else going on in this passage. So, but I don't want to spend too much time in the weeds here. Let's move on to number 95. Quote, Chamfort. That a man who understood men and the crowd as well as Chamfort nevertheless joined the crowd and did not stay aside in philosophical renunciation and resistance, I can explain to myself only in this way. He had one instinct that was even stronger than his wisdom and had never been satisfied, hatred of all nobility by blood. Perhaps it was the old hatred felt by his mother, that was only too easy to explain and had been sanctified by him through his love for her, an instinct of revenge that went back to his boyhood and waited for the hour to revenge his mother. And now life and his genius, and no doubt most of all the paternal blood in his veins, had seduced him to join the ranks of this nobility as an equal for many, many years. Eventually, however, he could no longer endure the sight of himself, the sight of the old type under the old regime. He became repentant with a violent passion, and this led him to put on the clothes of the mob as his kind of hair shirt. He had a bad conscience because he had not taken revenge. Had Chamfort remained just a little more of a philosopher, the revolution would have missed out on its tragic wit and its sharpest sting. It would be regarded as a much more stupid event and would not seduce so many spirits. But the hatred and revenge of Chamfort educated a whole generation, and the most illustrious human beings passed through this school. Note that Mirabeau looked up to Chamfort as his higher and older self, from which he expected and accepted impulses, warnings, and verdicts. Mirabeau, who as a great human being, belongs to an altogether different order of greatness than even the foremost statesmen of yesterday and today. It is odd that despite such a friend and advocate, after all, we have Mirabeau's letters to Chamfort. This wittiest of all moralists has remained a stranger to the French, no less than Stendhal, who may well have had more thoughtful eyes and ears than any other Frenchman of this century. Is that because the latter had too many German and English traits to be tolerable for Parisians? While Chamfort, a man who was rich in depths and backgrounds of the soul, gloomy, suffering, ardent, a thinker who needed laughter as a remedy against life and who almost considered himself lost on every day on which he had not laughed, seems much more like an Italian, related to Dante and Leopardi, than like a Frenchman. We know the last words of Chamfort, and I'm going to read these in English. "Ah, my friend, at last I am about to leave this world where the heart must either break or become hard as bronze." These are surely not the words of a dying Frenchman. End quote. So this passage is about as much about Chamfort as about the French Revolution. And just a couple words about that again from Kaufman's footnotes. I'll just read his footnote on this. Quote, "His celebrated collections of aphorisms provided one of the models for Nietzsche's aphoristic works. When the revolution broke out, he was one of the first of those who stormed the Bastille to enter the building, but later he spoke as sarcastically of the convention as he had earlier spoken of the royal court. He was arrested, released, and tried to kill himself before being rearrested. He died a few days later." So what is there to say about this passage? I mean, it's really one of those passages that, again, modern people might not understand the territory as much. It's probably less interesting if you think the French Revolution was a positive development. Nietzsche sort of has to explain to himself how a man like Chamfort was seduced by the French Revolution. I mean, this is one of those 6 great French writers of all time, and he goes along with the French Revolution, and he settles on this idea. He must have internalized a hatred for the old nobilities of blood that was never satisfied before, and he's swept away in this mass movement. So there's just like an unsatisfied impulse that wanted to break out along with the rest of the impulses of the masses. A very Nietzschean analysis of why things like revolutions happen. But other than this, I must say there's little to nothing indicating anything about Chamfort's literary significance. It's more just, the interesting part of the passage for me is the end, Nietzsche's disappointment that Chamfort has not significantly impacted the French national spirit. He also mentions Stendhal. Both are strangers to the French, and Chamfort's last words are very un-French. And these are 2 of Nietzsche's favorite authors. Again, I think the main thing that'll be of lasting value about this passage is go make note of this whenever Nietzsche mentions a writer in these terms, and then go read what Nietzsche read. If it was good enough for Nietzsche, it's probably good enough for you. So to get more out of this, I would say you have to go read Chamfort. But there is at least a sort of an interesting... It's interesting insofar as Nietzsche is willing to take on those counterexamples, or those examples that would seem to be an exception or a contradiction to a rule he's laid down. Explaining why a man like Chamfort participates in the revolution is an interesting question to Nietzsche. But, this might also be one of those passages that was too ahead of its time and now looks almost as if, the sentiment isn't worth expressing because it's so obvious, but the idea that people have these unconscious motivations, that there could be like a desire or an impulse unsatisfied that builds up over the years and then has to be released, this sort of like physiological accounting, psychological accounting for actions that result in mass political movements. I think we can all vibe with that kind of thinking, but for people in Nietzsche's time, this was kind of a new way of thinking about the world. So we can give him a little bit of credit for that too. Let's go on to 96, 2 speakers. Quote, "Of these 2 speakers, one can show the full rationality of his cause only when he abandons himself to passion." This alone pumps enough blood and heat into his brain to force his high spirituality to reveal itself. The other one may try the same now and then, to present his cause sonorously, vehemently, and to sweep his audience off their feet with the help of passion, but usually with little success. Soon he speaks obscurely and confusedly, he exaggerates, he omits things, and he arouses mistrust about the rationality of his cause. Actually, he himself comes to feel mistrust, and that explains sudden leaps into the coldest and most repugnant tones that lead his audience to doubt whether his passion was genuine. In his case, passion always inundates the spirit, perhaps because it is stronger than in the first speaker. But he is at the height of his powers when he resists the flood of his emotions and virtually derides it. Only then does his spirit emerge fully from its hiding place, a logical, mocking, playful, and yet awesome spirit." End quote. So in the broadest outlines, the point that Nietzsche is making here is pretty easy to grasp. I mean, there are different capacities that we may have based on our emotional constitutions as people. Again, I mean, this is really just predating a lot of work in psychology concerning, in this case, personality types. And so, because the idea of personality types is fairly common, it's easy to see what Nietzsche is getting at. You have one person who's at their best in speaking, advocating for their cause, communicating, etc. They're at their best when they're emotional, and another who sabotages themselves when they get emotional. They would be at their best if they remained aloof, we'll say. I mean, Nietzsche says mocking and logical, and it might be interesting to think of which famous figures would fit into each category. But let's look at a couple of interesting details. I mean, for one, Nietzsche says, the emotional speaker, the one who is at his best when he abandons himself to passion, allows the full rationality of his position to shine through in that manner. So his abandonment to passion allows the logic of his position to reveal itself. That's a very odd thing to happen, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those ideas that Nietzsche's that I always reference because it's so explanatory. But the notion that drives are kind of like subcomplexes. They're not actually like that sophisticated in that they don't carry a whole personality. The drives are pretty one-dimensional. They're one note, so to speak. They're completely the thing that they are, whether that is the urge or the impulse to fight, to reproduce, protect one's young, or even more nuanced and modern urges, like the urge for social validation, the desire to be respected by the great minds of your field, whatever the drive may be. Even though they're one-dimensional, the drives have their own form of reasoning, so to speak. And Nietzsche basically questions the entire constitution, the entire construction and pattern of thinking as we normally think about thinking, which is one of Nietzsche's more radical ideas. Thoughts are not produced by a unitary ego. The origin of a thought is a drive. The ego consciousness, therefore, is a kind of like rationalization. It's like a unifying mental impulse that gives these post hoc explanations in terms of the existence of a total unified organism. But the individual drives in Nietzsche's description are basically autonomous and sometimes even competitive or conspiring with one another as well. And so a thought comes not when I wish it, but when it wishes. And the thought is the product of a tyrannical and single-minded drive that will reason in its own certain way, certainly not by the Socratic or the theoretical conception of how logic works. This sort of detached process in which judgment can be rendered as though it were a view from nowhere, so to speak. I mean, Nietzsche would say that's a fantasy. A thought or a mode of valuing or a mode of living is always driven by a form of logic which is interested and is certainly not a view from nowhere. And so this is all to say, the idea that a person's passions might reveal the full rationality of their position actually has a sense to it, even though it sounds paradoxical if we study Nietzsche's new image of thought. And it's easy to think of examples of this. I mean, any political cause in which there's a martyr or there's a grievance, right? Often legitimate martyrs and legitimate grievances can be used, but not always. A really emotional speaker can be called for in that case to stir people to like political action on that basis. You know, the grieving mother who stands up before a crowd and says, "My child is dead because of that policy." And maybe there's no logical arguments in it at all. She just tells this very emotional tale, a tale of her own grief, and this reveals the logic of her cause. We'll make sure this never happens again. I mean, I don't know. This is fairly obvious if you studied public speaking or rhetoric, but I guess maybe Nietzsche's interesting point here is that, he doesn't treat this move to invoke pathos as though it's necessarily disingenuous or manipulative. If anything, it's the other way around. You're not conjuring your own passion dishonestly. Passion honestly reveals the logic of your position, which means, if we really trace this back to its ultimate conclusions, it means all positions find at their root not a logic, but a passion. That logic follows after the passion. Why is the second speaker then less convincing than the first? Nietzsche suggests one reason. The kind of person who mistrusts their passions is likely to reveal himself as disingenuous. So it's precisely because that they're being honest when they invoke their emotions that the first type of the speaker is at their best. And it's precisely because the second type of speaker is the kind of man who's been ruined by civilization, we might say, by the process of domestication, which has taught us all not to trust our passions, to regard them as a potential cause of ruination, something that might lead us to immorality or vice. If someone's really been inculcated with those kinds of valuations of the passions, they're going to be at their best when they manage to remain detached from them, when they manage to remain logical and playful and mocking. And I think, given the title of this work and the preamble that Nietzsche gave, all the way back at the beginning of the text, the beginning of the gay science, I think this is perhaps Nietzsche at his most logical, playful, and mocking, right? This really is the text where Nietzsche is taking on the mantle of that artistic Socrates. And I think that's why so many people connect with this book above a lot of the others. Being gaily scientific is what is called for in this project. And so Nietzsche, while he does at times represent that first type of speaker, I think he is at his best, particularly during this period when he writes more like the second type. And after all, could the first type really explain to you why their own abandonment to the passions reveals a kind of rationality? Or would they be unable to do so because they'd be swooning in the perceived reality of their passions? And that is, again, just in the background, the hint of that eternal dilemma in Nietzsche, exposing life to the cutting blade of rationality is a hindrance to life, but understanding only comes with the wielding of that blade. So those of us who wish to both understand and to foster life have to simultaneously come at it from both perspectives, and that's why Nietzsche operates in this manner. So let's go to number 97, and that's going to be the last aphorism for today. Quote, on the garrulousness of writers. There is a garrulousness of wrath, frequently encountered in Luther as well as Schopenhauer, a garrulousness due to a superabundant supply of conceptual formulations, as in Kant, a garrulousness due to the delight in ever new twists of the same thing, to be found in Montaigne, a garrulousness of spiteful characters. Anyone who reads contemporary publications will recall two writers of this type. A garrulousness due to the delight in good words and language forms, not at all rare in Goethe's prose, a garrulousness due to an inner pleasure in noise and confused emotions, for example, in Carlyle. End quote. So, garrulousness, talkativeness, yapping in modern terms. So, in so many words, Nietzsche is saying, look at all these people who produced volumes and volumes and volumes of books, yapping, going on and on and on, because that's what writers do. That's one of their great traits or flaws. And he shows here that isn't just from a single drive that a writer is garrulous. It could be from wrath. It could be from spite. It could be from a superabundant supply of conceptual formulations. It could even be, as in the case of Goethe, a delight in good words and language forms. So Goethe writes so many poems that R.J. Hollingdale says that he threatened to exhaust the capacities of the German language. But Goethe's poems aren't this pathological outpouring of negative or reactive feelings. They aren't driven by an excess of conceptualizations as in Kant. They're not driven by the inner turmoil of a Thomas Carlyle. Goethe really loves language. He's a poet's poet, right? His craft is his life. The spinning of a beautiful phrase, the pairing of words in novel ways to reveal new sentiments, manipulate the double and triple meanings you can give to words in these combinations. Goethe is an artist. He's an artist with words, and he delights in his art. And so he produces perhaps an excessive volume of his art, because that's simply what he did. Why do you write? He has no choice. But the interesting thing is that, at least among the writers listed in this passage, Goethe seems to be the exception here. Oftentimes the reason why someone writes isn't because their passion is like a pure delight in the artistry. That's how we often imagine quote-unquote true art. But true art is always the communication of some inner passion, and these men had an excessive passion that simply had to keep expressing itself. So Schopenhauer, for instance, Nietzsche says, was garrulous out of wrath. Elsewhere in his work, he alleges that Schopenhauer's main problem was libidinal. It was his own inner war with his own sexuality, that he basically dramatizes into an entire metaphysics of will and representation. I've talked about this at length elsewhere, but I think putting it in those terms is helpful, because if we cross-reference that notion with this passage, number 97 in the Gay Science, we'd have to conclude that Schopenhauer's garrulousness, his yapping, is at bottom an expression of his libido. And so yet again, in modern psychology, in which we have all accepted the idea of sublimation, this is all, I guess it's old hat, but in Nietzsche's day, this passage was actually pretty innovative. Nietzsche's saying, great works of literature, all of these are projects of sublimation. There's another passage elsewhere where Nietzsche says, more succinctly, making music is a different way of making children. And that's really what's being expressed here, is that same notion of sublimation. But what comes with that, the other side of the coin of sublimation, is the understanding that many different things can be sublimated to give the same sign or symptom, if that makes sense. And that just, I don't know, that it opens up a whole nother can of worms of interpretations. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about this aphorism. That's all for this week, everyone. We have one more reading of Book 2 before we move on and hit the second leg of Season 3. For those who are not in the know or have forgotten how we're doing this, we're doing a book at a time in between regular season episodes. And I did 8 episodes of the show in the first leg. And if we were to stick to that pattern, that would mean after episodes 9 through 16, we'd return to Book 3 of the Gay Science. And then we finish out the season with episodes 17 through 24. And then we'll do Book 4 in the interseason. So 3 8-episode legs with books 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Gay Science kind of bracketing each of those. And then you might be noticing, well, okay, what about Book 5? After that, to be honest, we'll probably do Book 5 as like an interlude in the middle of Season 6. And that's just how long this fucking book is, people. But Book 5 I feel fine about including next season because it was added later. The Gay Science, was published in 1882. That's just the first 4 books. It's only in 1887 that we get Book 5 as a kind of addendum, it's an inclusion of, if not Nietzsche's like later ideas, because the Gay Science, he really comes into his own. Most of the major ideas are here. It's maybe more later formulations or clarifications that supplement much of what's discussed here. So we'll probably do that in the middle of Season 6. It's just a weird thing to think about. So that's the plan. We'll hit the last episode of Book 2 of the Gay Science next week, and then we'll return to the podcast. And we're going to cover a couple of thinkers that have been requested many, many times in this next leg of the season. I'm very much looking forward to getting into some truly new territory. And I'm finally going to cover a couple of writers that I've wanted to talk about for a very long time. So it's an exciting time in the podcast. See you next week, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.